As you may or may not know, under the ability tab for each frame there are around 10 tips, with extra information about mechanics, synergies, and interactions. However, these tips range wildly in usefulness, from game-changing to almost useless, and there's also quite a bit of actual straight-up misinformation as well. I figured it'd be fun to take a look through these tips to see how useful or true they really are by testing them and doing some research. Since there's currently 64 Warframes and each frame has on average 10 tips, that's obviously quite a lot of work. So I've decided to split this project into 3 videos, covering around 20 frames in each. I'm also very far from an expert on a lot of these frames, so this video would not have been possible without the help from a bunch of people that are much smarter than me. The way this is gonna work is that I'll cover each frame one by one, reading through their ability tips and giving each tip a score between +3 and -3. Higher scores for more useful and properly explained tips, and lower scores for wrong and actively misleading tips. A score of 0 means that the tip is basically useless, just reiterating something that the ability description already says, or something ridiculously obvious. A score of +1 means that the tip is technically useful, but not really anything that exciting. A score of +2 means that the tip is decently useful or interesting, or lets use the ability in a fun new way. A score of +3 means that the tip is incredibly impactful. However, a score of +3 also often means that the information or advice is so important that it really should be part of an ability description instead of being hidden away in the ability tip section, which a lot of people won't ever read. In my opinion, an ability tip should be some extra additional information that is good to know but not required to know. A score of -1 means that the tip is straight up wrong, but trying to follow it shouldn't lead to any major problems. A score of -2 means that the tip is wrong, and trying to follow its advice will lead to problems. A score of -3 means that the tip is not just wrong, but incredibly misleading, to the point where trying to follow its advice will absolutely screw you over. An ability tip being wrong is obviously bad, but a score of -3 means that it should be removed from the game as soon as possible, as it is just harmful misinformation. After covering the tips, I'll see if there's any other interesting stuff that I think could be added as an ability tip, though to be clear, I won't have that for every frame. Also, while I'm clarifying things, when I talk about the ability description, I'm talking about the text that describes what an ability does and how it works. Ability stats are the numbers below the description, that describes damage numbers, duration, range, that sort of stuff. Lastly, ability tips are the tips specifically found in the abilities tabs for each frame. Hopefully that makes sense, or at least it should as I get into the actual tips. Excalibur. Excalibur is immune to damage for the duration of /dash, +3. This gives /dash a whole new use case as a defensive tool. I really think the ability description should just mention that it makes him invulnerable. Radio Blind can temporarily deactivate laser barriers and security cameras, +1. This does work, but to clarify, it deactivates laser barriers by disabling security cameras. It's pretty janky as you need to be within the security camera's line of sight, though that doesn't mean you have to be spotted. If you are spotted before casting Radio Blind, it still activates the laser barrier, which stays active for a couple seconds even after you blind the camera. It's kinda cool, but usually a lot more trouble than it's worth. Cast Radio Blind to open enemies to finishers. Blinding also grants a stealth bonus to all melee strikes, including Exalted Blade, +3. Opening enemies to finishers is basically the main point of Radio Blind outside of its crowd control. This absolutely should be mentioned by the actual ability description. The stealth bonus part could definitely be explained better, as Excalibur only gains the bonus damage against the blinded enemies. I do like that it mentions that blinding enemies lets you count as being stealthed, and that being stealth increases melee damage. That part works pretty well as a tip. Each enemy hit with /dash adds to Excalibur's melee combo counter, +1. It gives +1 combo for every enemy hit, which isn't really enough to build a combo, but it's still a neat effect. Perform a melee spin attack with Exalted Blade to create a small Radio Blind for half the energy cost, +3. This is a pretty neat effect, as it gives you a much cheaper way to open enemies to finishers, but despite that, I don't really love this effect. For half the energy cost, you get only a third of the range, and if you don't know that this mechanic exists, you'll likely be wasting a ton of energy for no reason. While you can definitely use this mechanic to your benefit, it's often just a better idea to avoid using slide attacks. I'd really like for this to be explained in the ability description somehow. Cast /dash on an enemy while Exalted Blade is active to launch energy waves, +2. I really like this mechanic. It's flavorful, it's fun, and also pretty strong, and it would be a shame to not know that it exists. While Exalted Blade is active, /dash is granted a small bonus to its base damage, +1. Slash Dash deals the exact same damage regardless of if Exalted Blade is active or not. The added energy wave does give another hit, so the damage does technically go up, but it has nothing to do with base damage. Exalted Blade's innate punch through allows its wave to traverse through obstacles to enemies, +2. This is really good to know, and lets you do some fun stuff by hitting enemies through walls. Build up bonus damage for Exalted Blade's energy waves and Excalibur's melee combo counter by striking enemies at close range with the sword itself, -2. You don't build up the damage for the waves in any way, they don't scale with combo. This step also implies that Exalted Blade only builds combo when hitting enemies with the sword itself, which isn't true. Honestly, just ignore this advice. Excalibur's Exalted Blade can be separately modded in the arsenal, +3. I get that this is probably obvious to most people, but it's literally not mentioned anywhere else, which is crazy with how important it is. It's really weird that modding isn't mentioned in the descriptions for Exalted weapons, when the descriptions for pseudo-Exalted weapons like Landslide or Shattered Lash mention them being moddable. Umbra generally just has the same ability descriptions, but there are 3 exceptions. Cast Radial Howl to get a stealth bonus on enemies that are open to finishers, +1. For some reason this is worded differently than base Excalibur's tip, and it's honestly just worse. This is the same information, except it doesn't mention that Radial Howl itself also opens enemies to finishers, which is the most important part of the base tip. It's just really strange. Radial Howl strips sentient enemies of any active damage resistances, 0. This is already mentioned by the ability description, so why is this also a tip? It also overrides the tip about Slash Dash building combo, so what the hell? Cast Slash Dash while Exalted Blade is active to launch energy waves towards an enemy and any behind them, +2. This one is also slightly rewarded with some extra stuff added, but it just ends up being really confusing. The energy waves created during Slash Dash aren't aimed at enemies, they're just created when Excalibur hits the enemy without any extra targeting, so I'm not really sure what this is trying to say. Now, for some extra ability tips that I think could be added. Jump, roll, or melee attack while dashing between enemies to end Slash Dash early. Slash Dash uses Exalted Blade and its equipped mods when dealing damage, though this arguably should just be part of the ability description like it is with all the other pseudo-exalted abilities. Slash Dash deals 25% more damage per combo level, up to 275% more damage at 12 times combo. While enemies blinded by Radial Blind can't see you, they will still react to sound and attack where they think you are. Exalted Blade's heavy attack fires a massive cross-shaped projectile that lifts enemies. Lift duration scales with combo. Hit enemies with both Exalted Blade's blade and the energy waves to generate combo twice as fast. Exalted Blade's energy waves only deal their full damage up close, gradually falling off with distance, until they no longer deal any damage after 70 meters. Exalted Blade's attacks will all move Excalibur forwards, but crouching while attacking lets Excalibur stay completely stationary. Mag. Cast Polarize to strip enemy armor and shields before casting Crush for more effective destruction, +1. This is just saying that enemies are easier to kill after removing their armor and shields, which is pretty obvious. It does give the idea that you can play Mag as a combo caster, weakening enemies before casting her damage ability, even though doing that won't kill most enemies above level 30. Cast Pull to draw enemies away from allies that are at risk of being downed, +1. Yeah, that's what a crowd control ability does, prevents enemies from attacking and posing a threat. Though this tip does give a concrete use case, so sure, whatever. Cast Magnetize on high priority enemy units to keep them at bay and inflict continuous damage onto them, +1. This just hammers home the main use case for Magnetize, which is fairly obvious, but it's probably best to ensure that players understand this. Magnetized targets take increased damage from Pull and Polarize, +1. This is true, the damage multiplier works on any damage, it's basically just damage vulnerability from my testing. But this only applies to the magnetized target itself, and it's just not that impactful, since Pull and Polarize aren't exactly damage abilities. Crush is also affected, and the multiplier is actually doubled, though that's usually still not enough to make Crush a viable damage ability. Projectile weapons with punch through are especially devastating inside magnetized bubbles, circling through enemies multiple times, +3. This is crucial information for getting the most out of Magnetize. It's an incredibly powerful effect that changes how you play Mag and what weapons you use on her, though I can't see why this wouldn't fit in the ability description. Multiple Magnetized bubbles can be placed on different enemies at once. If the limit is reached, the first bubble will detonate if the target is no longer alive, +2. This is pretty important to know, as it otherwise isn't clear that you can have multiple bubbles at the same time. It is kind of annoying that the maximum amount of bubbles isn't stated anywhere. It really should just say 3 instead of multiple. It feels like DE are just allergic to using accurate numbers in their ability descriptions and tips sometimes. Magnetized bubbles explode and deal blast damage if the originating target dies before the ability has ended, +1. While this tip is correct and somewhat useful, it neglects to explain how this explosion works, which is actually a really big deal. The magnetized bubble stores 25% of the damage of projectiles fired into it, dealing this damage to all enemies inside every 0.5 seconds, and again when the bubble collapses and explodes. This turns magnetized into a weapon damage-fueled nuke, which is incredibly effective. And this really should be what the tip explains. Cast Polarize to replenish the shields of defense objectives, if they are getting low, +1. This is true, but the shield restore often isn't really enough to make much of a difference to defense objectives who often have thousands of shields. However, now that excavators have a shield gate, it might be fairly solid for excavation. Crush grants shields to nearby allies, including companions when cast, +3. A really big part of why you want to be using Crush. This really should be part of the actual ability description. The ability stats do mention shields on hit, but the description doesn't mention the shield gain at all. It's also kind of strange that it doesn't mention that Mac herself also gets the shields. Extra tips. Enemies pulled and grouped by pull are open to ground finishers. Magnetized deals constant magnetic damage based on bullets and projectiles fired into it. The stored damage is then unleashed when magnetized ends, adding to the explosion damage. Magnetized also affects allied weapons and abilities. Magnetize even affects enemy attacks. Use this by hiding behind magnetized targets to avoid enemy fire. Polarize starts at 8 meters and expands every second up to 37.5 meters. This results in Polarize's range benefiting significantly more from duration mods than range mods. Enemies that lose shields or armor from Polarize deal damage based on the amount of shields or armor lost to all nearby enemies. Polarize removes a flat amount of shields or armor from enemies, making it worse against higher level enemies that have higher amounts of shields or armor. Polarize shards can inflict both slash and puncture when hitting enemies. For some reason, Polarize's description only mentioned the shards dealing slash. Volt. Cast speed to cover distance quickly and rapidly build damage for Volt's passive. 0. This is kinda cool in theory, however, Volt's passive just isn't strong enough to be worth playing around, so trying to follow this advice is kind of just a waste of time. Cast shock on a priority target to temporarily stun them and open an opportunity for attack. -1. Most of what could be considered priority targets these days are Eximus units, Disruption Demolishers, and other enemies that are usually immune to crowd control and status effects. And also, this is definitely a nitpick, but I really thought the open and opportunity for attack meant that the enemies would be open to finishers, which isn't the case. Even beyond that, all this tip is trying to say is that shock can be used to crowd control enemies. Cast shock on an enemy affected by discharge to release an electric burst to nearby enemies. -1. I might be wrong, but I don't think this actually works. This is just the damage from shock. Though, let's be real, even if it did work, the damage still wouldn't be enough to be worth playing around. Electric Shield increases the critical damage of weapons fired through it, +3. A really powerful effect that somehow isn't mentioned in the ability description, which is really stupid. This should probably say doubles instead of just increases, as it actually doubles critical chance after mods and all other buffs, which is absolutely insane. Cast and shoot through multiple electric shields to stack the electricity damage from each shield, +2. Maybe not always super practical with how much setup it takes, but it makes up for that by just being really cool. Cast multiple electric shields around a defense point to protect it from all angles, +1. A fairly obvious use case, but still good to mention. It's pretty dumb that the max amount of shields, 6, isn't mentioned anywhere. This tip could be changed to something like, Volt can have up to 6 electric shields active at the same time. Use this to protect a defense point from all angles. Pick up Volt's electric shield to be used as mobile cover while on the move. Sprint into enemies to knock them over, +3. Picking up the shield should definitely be part of the ability description, especially now that you can hold cast to deploy the shield as held. This is a game changer when it comes to playing Volt and makes it much easier to benefit from the electric and critical damage buffs. The part about knocking enemies down works fine as an ability tip though, I guess. Weapons with toxin, cold, or heat damage create combined elements with the electricity damage from electric shield, -3. This is straight up not true anymore, as it was changed to be non-combining in update 38. If you rely on this to get corrosive or magnetic, you'll be pretty disappointed. I could also see someone avoiding using electric shield because they assume it would mess up their status procs, not wanting their heat to turn into radiation, for example. This just really needs to be updated or maybe just removed entirely. Cast Shock and Discharge on a tightly packed group of enemies to chain the stun from electricity status effect. -2. This is really misleading, as it seems to imply that the stun from electricity applies to all enemies in the AoE, which is just not the case. It also implies that Discharge applies electricity, which it also doesn't do. Stun enemies affected by Discharge for longer with ability duration mods. 0. This just states that Discharge's duration scales with duration mods, which is what duration mods do. Cast Shock on an electric shield to electrify it, causing it to deal electricity damage to enemies that pass through it. -1. I could have sworn that this worked, but after some testing, I just can't seem to get it to work. Even then, Shock's damage still sucks, so it's not really that big of a deal. Allies within range of Volt when speed is cast will also benefit, but can backflip if they wish to opt out of its effects, +2. The first part about the buff being shared with allies is already mentioned in the ability description, but the part of being able to opt out is really useful to know. It would be really nice if you didn't have to own Volt and read his ability description to know how to opt out, but it's good to have this information somewhere. Extra tips. The stored damage from Volt's passive increases Shock's damage. Shock can target an enemy at any distance, letting you stun enemies from across the map. Not really a tip, but Speed's description or stats really should mention that it gives melee attack speed. It's really stupid that it doesn't. Operator amps can also benefit from Electric Shield's electric and critical damage buffs. Holding Electric Shield lets Volt block knockdowns from the front, including those from his own explosive weapons. Discharge causes affected enemies to damage all enemies around them, but this also results in Discharge not initially dealing damage to isolated enemies. Isolated targets only begin taking damage after 4.5 seconds, with this delay being reduced by Volt's passive. Discharge deals significantly more damage the more enemies are closer to each other, making it stronger in higher enemy density missions or when enemies are grouped up. Trinity. Cast Well of Life or Energy Vampire on high priority targets to take them out of battle by suspending them in the air. -3. Well of Life and Energy Vampire obviously can't be cast on overguarded enemies, but it can be cast on Demolishers and Acolytes. However, it doesn't crowd control them and just ends up making them invulnerable, which is a pretty major problem. So you really shouldn't be casting Well of Life on the big scary enemies, and this is just really bad advice. Also, Energy Vampire doesn't suspend enemies in the air, which is clearly the biggest problem here. Recasting Well of Life releases the oldest enemy when at max targets, +1. This is also how most other similar abilities like Max Magnetize works, so it shouldn't be that surprising. Also, shout out to Well of Life's ability stats for actually saying that it has a cap of 3. Kill an enemy marked by Energy Vampire to immediately transfer all of its remaining energy reserves to nearby allies, +3. This is really good to know, as it completely changes how you can approach using Energy Vampire, as you can just cast it on a weaker enemy and kill it to instantly gain all the energy. I think this could be added to the ability description in some way. Increasing ability duration will cause Energy Vampire targets to release additional pulses, granting more total energy from each target, +1. This feels pretty obvious, but it's probably for the best to have it explained in a tip. Cast Energy Vampire to replenish Trinity's energy pool before casting her other abilities. 0. Energy Vampire restores energy, and you need energy to cast abilities. This is just kind of stupid. It's like saying, Well of Life restores health, you can use this healing to stay alive. Link redirects status effects back towards linked enemies, +3. Really important, this should be just in the ability description. While Well of Life does also provide status immunity, Link is a much more portable way to prevent status effects. Use Link tethers to track down nearby enemies through walls, +1. The minimap and its enemy radar already does this for you, and this becomes pretty obvious when you're in an actual mission, but it's still good to point out. For some reason, Link can't connect to capture targets, which is a shame because it would be really useful for when they go invisible. Blessing applies to drones and other non-player allies within affinity range. Healing also applies to defense objectives, excavators, and other defendable points, at diminished rate, +2. This is a cool effect, however the healing for defense objectives is capped at 500 health over 5 seconds, which is pretty much nothing. But more importantly, the damage reduction, or at least 50% damage reduction, also applies to defense objectives, which is a significantly bigger deal. I also have no idea why it says drones. There are defendable drones on the plains of Eidolon and the Orb Valles, but it seems strange to mention that specifically. I don't know, that just seems weird to me. Cast Blessing within the shared affinity range to benefit all allies. Use the player list to see who is currently within range at the time of casting, +1. Blessing's description already explains that its range is affinity range, but the second part about who is within affinity range is a great tip, as I don't think that's ever really explained anywhere else. Extra tips. Okay, I don't think this should be a tip, but Will of Life does a terrible job of saying it gives status immunity. Instead it says that it absorbs status effect damage, which is confusing as hell for no reason. Will of Life is one of the few sources of healing that aren't reduced when healing defense objectives. Damage reduction from Blink and Blessing are multiplicative to each other, providing Trinity with up to almost 94% damage reduction, which is then increased even more by armor or the innate 50% damage reduction from player shields. Link can tether to Will of Life targets, turning the redirected damage into healing. Link's damage redirection and status immunity only work when linked to at least one enemy. When Will of Life's death prevention activates, it kills the Will of Life target instantly. This can be used to kill particularly tough enemies, but boss enemies and disruption demolishers aren't killed but just take damage. Rhino. Rhino is immune to damage during Rhino charge, -2. As it turns out, this invulnerability only applies to Rhino's health, but not his shield, and more importantly, not to his iron skin, making the invulnerability basically pointless. Cast Rhino charge on enemies that have been stunned by Stomp for more damage, +1. This damage buff is multiplicative to Strength, Roar, and Rhino charges combo, which is multipliers on multipliers and eventually can end up doing decent damage. Now, is it enough damage to warrant the amount of investment and setup required? Well, if you want to do damage with Rhino charge, you have the option, which is neat. And once again, this should just say double instead of more. Cast Iron Skin before Rhino charge to increase the blast damage dealt to enemies, +1. Please note that this isn't blast damage, but a guaranteed blast status. On its own, this isn't particularly exciting, but it does allow for some interesting setups with Seconding Pulse, turning Rhino Charge into a functional nuke, with a lot of effort. I recommend checking out Amalistic's video on it. While it is cool that it exists, for most people and the way they'll likely be playing Rhino, this tip is ultimately not all that impactful. Cast Rhino Charge in quick succession to reduce its energy cost and double its damage and range, +1. The damage buff actually goes up to 4 times, and is multiplicative to both Strength and Roar, though it's still hard to use Rhino Charge to deal damage due to its knocking back and ragdolling enemies. The range increase only goes up to 1.5 times, not double, but the cost reduction goes up to 75% and is multiplicative to efficiency. All this makes Rhino Charge a fairly decent, or at least cheap, mobility option. Iron Skin prevents status effects such as slash and knockdowns, +2. Anyone who knows how Overguard works should already know this. Still, it's a crucial part of what makes Iron Skin so strong. It is worth noting that casting Iron Skin won't cleanse any active status effects, so you'll have to wait them out, though that shouldn't be a problem with the invulnerability period. Iron Skin scales off both ability strength and armor mods, and the damage absorbed when cast determines its overguard, +3. The fact that Iron Skin scales with armor is pretty impactful, and definitely should be mentioned in the ability description. The ability description also really should explain the absorption mechanic, as it's the core mechanic of the ability. It's worth noting that strength and armor doesn't affect the absorbed damage, it just increases the base amount of overguard. Cast Iron Skin when taking heavy damage to convert more damage into its total overguard, +3. As I just went over, this desperately needs to be in the main ability description. It is kind of ridiculous that it isn't. The ability stats do mention a 3-second invulnerability period, but it never explains what that means and how important it is. Iron Skin's remaining overguard total is displayed next to Rhino's health bar. Watch for when it gets low to recast when it runs out. 0. I feel like this is just so ridiculously obvious that it feels a little silly to explain this in a tip, so it's not really a great tip. Cast Roar when allies are within the ability radius, to ensure they do not miss out on its damage increasing benefits. 0. Roar already states that it applies to nearby allies. I don't see why there would need to be an ability tip to explain this. It might be more useful if it explained that this is important because Roar can be recast, so you have to make sure you're affecting as many allies as possible. Or you could just jump out of bounds and then you can recast. Honestly, most non-recastable abilities are just kind of stupid in my opinion. Keep enemies affected by Stomp suspended in the air longer with ability duration mods. 0. This is the same as the Volt Discharge tip. It just says that the duration scales with duration mods. Extra tips. When in the air, Rhino's momentum is added to Rhino Charge. Unlike all other forms of Overguard, Rhino's Iron Skin can be dispelled by nullifiers or falling out of bounds. Roar's damage buff is multiplicative to damage mods like Serration, and uniquely also applies to Warframe abilities. Additionally, it is also calculated twice for status effect damage, like Slash or Toxin status. Loki. Escape danger by casting Decoy at a distance and switch teleporting to it, +2. A really cool synergy that really lets you live that trickster fantasy. It might not be the most useful thing in the world, but this is the type of thing that might get someone excited to play Loki. Cast Decoy before invisibility expires to draw fire away from Loki for the brief period he is visible before recasting, +1. This is pretty obvious, but again, it gives an idea of how Loki's playstyle works, and how his abilities fit together, which I kinda like. Cast Decoy in the middle of large groups to take advantage of the scaling health and shields absorbed from nearby enemies, +1. This is already explained in the ability description, but it's explained a little better here in my opinion. Cast Invisibility to stealthily revive fallen teammates, +1. Fairly obvious, but this is a decent use case for invisibility, I guess. Stay out of the line of fire while invisibility is active, and retreat when the ability is about to expire for a safer recast, +1. Also pretty obvious, but it's good to remind players that just because they're invisible doesn't mean they can't be hit in a crossfire. Switch teleport can be used on friendly characters like rescue targets, escort drones, and downed allies. Use it to reposition high priority targets to a safer location, +2. This is one of the better uses for Switch Teleport, an ability that can be kind of hard to figure out how you're supposed to use, so I really like that it's explained here. Cast Switch Teleport on priority and nearby targets to confusing, leaving them open to attack, +2. Unlike basically any other form of crowd control, Switch Teleport works on basically anything, including what most people would consider priority targets like overguarded enemies and even acolytes. I still think the open to attack could be misunderstood as opening to finishers, and I kinda wish it was worded differently or just not there at all. Switch Teleport with darkened pilots on the plains of Eidolon to steal their vehicle, +1. This is ridiculously niche, but it's really funny and worth trying at least once. This sadly doesn't work on the Darkins in the Kuva Fortress though. Unlike other factions, infested enemies are knocked down by radial disarm, +2. This is true, but there's a bit more to it. Infested enemies are always knocked down, and so are Murmur enemies. Some Tekrod enemies get knocked down, while others are disarmed. For the Anarchs, the Dax get knocked down, while the Grineer are disarmed. Irradiating Disarm is an augment mod for Radial Disarm that puts enemies into a frenzy with a radiation status effect, -2. This is the first of what will become a recurring type of tip, just saying that an augment exists and re-explaining what it does. If the tip has something new and interesting to say about the augment, then sure, but that's usually not the case. Augments are already explained somewhere else, so going forward, any tip that does this gets a 0, as it's just repeating already available information. This tip gets a -2 since it says that irradiating disarm applies radiation, when it actually applies a radiation-like effect, so any synergies with radiation just don't work. Extra tips. Enemies will prioritize attacking Decoy over anything else, even defensive objectives. As enemies target Decoy, they end up grouped up around it, making them easy targets for area of effect attacks. Decoy will alert nearby enemies by firing its gun. Keep this in mind if you don't want to alert enemies. Switch Teleport works as long as you can see the enemy, even through windows, letting you skip to the end of some spy vaults. Ember. Fireball gains increased damage when cast on enemies with heat status effects, -1. I suppose Fireball does technically deal more damage when enemies are on fire because of the strength from the passive, but outside of that, Fireball isn't dealing any extra damage, so this is just straight up wrong. Cast multiple Fireballs in quick succession to increase their damage output, +1. I'm so happy I finally get to talk about this, you have no idea. So, when you cast Fireball, there is a combo system that goes up to 8 times. If Immolation is maxed, Fireball has a constant base combo of 5, and can go up to 12 times combo. Now you might assume that 12 times combo means 12 times damage, but it obviously can't be that simple. Every combo level above 1 gives plus 50% damage, so 2 times combo gives plus 50% damage, 8 times combo is 350% damage, and 12 times combo is 550% damage. Why does it have to be this complicated in a way that ends up with Fireball being even worse than people already think? I don't know. Regardless, this tip just states that the combo system exists without explaining how it works at all, which is why it still just gets a +1. Cast Fireball to ignite and stagger groups of enemies gathered together in doorways or near objectives, +1. Fireball deals AoE damage, so you can hit multiple enemies, which Yeah, that makes sense. It also points out how Fireball can be used as a weak crowd control because of heat status, which is kinda helpful, I guess. Immolation's damage reduction increases based on current self-immolation levels. Increase the meter by casting Fireball or Inferno, +3. Somehow, the ability description doesn't talk about how you can increase the heat meter. Fireball and Inferno's ability stats do have an immolation meter on gain stat, but I really think this should be explained by immolation itself. This is mostly because immolation's actual description just sucks, and I really think it should be updated. If Ember reaches max immolation, she will overheat, slowly losing energy. Use Fire Blast to reduce immolation levels, or recast the ability to reset meter again, +3. Same as the last one. This should be an immolation or Fire Blast description, as it is a core part of how you're supposed to play Ember. Fire Blast immolation meter on cast -50% does a decent job of explaining what it does, but it's still such an important mechanic that it should be explained way better. Fire Blast sends enemies flying if they are nearby when the ability is cast. 0. Fire Blast description already says that it knocks back enemies. This tip is pretty pointless. Fire Blast costs less energy when immolation level is high. Alternate between abilities that increase and reduce immolation to maximize damage and minimize energy cost, +2. This tip does its best to explain how you should play around immolation, and why it's important to do so, to some level of success. Fire Blast armor reduction scales based on Ember's current immolation levels, +3. Yet another thing that should be explained in an ability description. Fire Blast ability stats just say armor reduction 50 to 100% without any further clarification. So you basically have to read this ability tip to even know how the ability works at all. All abilities struck by Inferno get a personal ring of fire, expanding over time and spreading to nearby enemies, +3. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but this should be in Inferno's description, instead of just a fire that can spread through their ranks. This is a fundamental part of how Inferno deals its damage, and you would never know that from reading Inferno's ability description. Inferno's fire ring damage increases based on current immolation levels, +3. Ember is a great example of why having a score of +3 is generally a bad thing. These ability tips are very useful, but they're also a crutch for how bad Ember's actual ability descriptions are. Immolation completely fails to mention that it affects her other abilities. For extra tips, I don't really have anything for Ember. Ash. Weapons that inflict slash damage deal more damage over time, with Ash's increased slash status effect passive, 0. Ash's passive that increases the damage over time from slash status increases the damage over time from slash status. Who would have thought? Like, what are we even doing here? Shuriken can seek and destroy nearby security cameras, +1. This does work and it's very thematic, but it's just too niche to really matter. Shuriken hits contribute to Ash's melee combo counter, +1. With 5 projectiles, this is 5 combo per cast. So this effect ultimately isn't that helpful, but it is nice for refreshing your combo timer. Smokescreen's invisibility also applies to Ash's companions, +2. This is pretty good to know, as it is logical to worry about your companions messing up your stealthy gameplay. It is worth noting that companions are technically always invisible, even benefiting from the melee stealth multiplier. Cast Smokescreen before activating Bladestorm to mark enemies under cover safely, +1. This is fairly obvious. Casting Bladestorm makes you vulnerable, so use Smokescreen to stay safe. Still, it's a good use case and important to keep in mind. Use Teleport to reach allies, rescue targets, cryopods, excavators, and more, +1. This just points out that Teleport can also be used on allies, which isn't super clear from the ability description, so it's good to have it mentioned here. Still, it's a very niche use case. Casting Teleport on a marked enemy, while Ash's shadow clones are attacking, does not consume energy, -1. You actually still need to have enough energy to cast Teleport. This synergy just refunds the energy afterwards, so the does not consume energy part is wrong. This might save you like 25 energy sometimes, so it's pretty minor. Ash is immune to damage while teleporting to an enemy during Shadow Clone attacks, +2. It's nice to know that you don't have to worry about dying while stuck in the animation, though it does feel a little obvious since most other abilities work the same way. Bladestorm's damage scales with mods equipped on Shadow Clones, as well as the ability combo counter, +2. Bladestorm scaling with mods is already mentioned in its ability description, however the fact that it scales with combo isn't. I get that it might seem obvious to some people, but it's ridiculously impactful and should be explained somewhere. Any source of invisibility reduces the cost of Bladestorm, +2. This is pretty cool and opens up some cool synergies, like using Arcane Trickery or a Hero's Cobra instead of a Smokescreen. Ash can teleport to any enemy in his line of sight. Use this to bypass windows, laser barriers, and more. +1. This is pretty cool and can be used to skip to the end of some spy mission vaults. But that is still very niche and situational. I do want to note that you often have to press your face up against the window to teleport through it. The Bladestorm ability input can be held to target enemies, and activates upon release instead of tapping the ability input twice. +2. This is just really solid quality of life advice that lets you use whatever feels more comfortable. As for extra tips, I yet again don't really have anything, sorry. Nyx. Mind-controlled enemies visually react before turning on their allies. Damage dealt to them during this window will increase their damage output while they are under Nyx's control. +2. This seems like a slightly better, though still not perfect, explanation of how Nyx can empower her mind control target by shooting it. Cast Mind Control on Shield Osprey so Nyx and allies can benefit from their shield regenerating effect. +2. This is a really cool unique use case for Mind Control, though it would be really cool if it mentioned that Mind Control also works on other enemies with special supportive effects like Ancients and Eximus units. Mind-controlled enemies will attack aggressively, with little regard for self-preservation, prioritizing enemies that Nyx is currently targeting. -1. I'm not sure how well this actually works. From my testing, the mind control target seems to just focus on the nearest enemy, and definitely still tries to hide and take cover. Cast Psychic Bolts to temporarily disable auras from Ancients. +1. I initially thought that this is because it applies radiation, which prevents Ancients from buffing other enemies, but no, Psychic Bolts actually doesn't apply radiation, it just disables Ancient auras. It doesn't seem to work on other enemies like Shield Ospreys though, who are affected by radiation. This results in the effect being pretty pointless since Nyx spreads a ton of radiation with Mind Control and Chaos, which does the same thing and more. Psychic Bolts can be recast anytime to engage new targets. 0. This tip is pretty weird. I think I get what it's trying to say, but especially now that Psychic Bolts spread on kill, it's pretty pointless. Psychic Bolts siphons enemies' defenses into Nyx. This applies to shields, armor, and overguard. +2. This is already mentioned in the ability stats, but that thing is a complete mess, so it's nice to have it explained here. Casting Absorb while airborne allows Nyx to float above the battlefield. Hold jump to float upwards or crouch to float down, drawing as much fire as possible. +1. This explains the flying mechanics of Absorb, which aren't that hard to figure out on your own, but it's good to have them explained somewhere. Absorb also converts damage received from allies. Coordinate with allies to build up a more powerful explosion. -2. This sadly doesn't work, and it's honestly pretty disappointing. Maybe it's too strong to have a non-line of sight 50-meter nuke that scales with player weapon damage, but that requires teamwork, setup, and has damage fall off, so I don't see why it shouldn't be able to do this. Either way, this tip is wrong, and trying to follow it will just waste your time. Damage that enemies do to each other is added to Absorb's detonation if the ability is active. Create mass confusion with Mind Control and Chaos before casting Absorb to maximize damage. +1. Enemies dealing damage to each other adding to Absorb is already mentioned in the ability description, but this gives a concrete example of how to get the most out of it, so sure, that deserves a +1. Nyx is completely invulnerable during Absorb, making it a great last resort when under heavy fire, +3. Absorb's description only mentions that it gives invulnerability after it ends. You could arguably infer that it makes Nyx invulnerable, but you shouldn't have to infer that, the description should just say it. This is a major part of what the ability offers, and as such, it should be part of the ability description. Recast Absorb while active to detonate the bubble early, +1. This is fairly obvious, and most other similar abilities also work this way, but it doesn't hurt to make it clear in an ability tip. Extra tips. Mind Control's target will teleport to Nyx if she moves more than 60 meters away from it. Enemies with special abilities like Ancients, Shield Ospreys, and Eximus units will use their abilities to support Nyx and her allies while mind controlled, and can in turn be affected by healing and buffs from Nyx and her allies. Most enemies with no armor or shields for Psychic Bolts to steal, like the Infested, are instead slowed. Enemies affected by Chaos will attack anything close to them, including Nyx and her allies. Stay at a distance to let enemies focus on each other instead of you. Radiation status effects cause enemies to deal up to 550% more damage to each other. Use this to increase the damage of the mind control target and the amount of damage Absorb gains from enemy infighting. Absorb's explosion damage falls off with range, so make sure enemies are close before Absorb ends. Absorb blocks allied projectiles, so make sure you're not in the way. However, with Absorb's augment, Assimilate, allied projectiles don't just pass through Nyx, but also deal double critical damage. This increase of critical damage does not apply to Nyx's own weapons. Frost. Pair Frost with weapons that deal cold status to freeze enemies quicker. Spreading cold to nearby enemies with weapons also increases the armor Frost gains from his passive, -1. The first part feels pretty misleading. Frost does not freeze enemies faster with weapons that apply cold. Most of his abilities already instantly freeze enemies, so using cold weapons is pretty pointless. The second part just confirms that cold status from sources other than his abilities also give him armor, which is nice but also pretty obvious. Using weapons to spread cold runs into one of Frost's core issues. You're always just better off casting Avalanche. Using your weapons to spread cold is just less effective. Cast Freeze on the ground to create an icy path, adding cold status effects to nearby enemies. 0. To me, path refers to a lingering zone, which this isn't. It's just talking about the AoE explosion of Freeze's projectile, which applies 6 stacks of cold. It's technically true, but it's also misleading as hell, and the effect is bordering on being completely worthless. Cast Freeze on the outside of a snow globe to destroy it and deal cold damage to nearby enemies. This can also be used to remove globes from undesirable locations. +1. The explosion is actually really small, only around 1 meter bigger than the snow globe itself. Still, it's a really cool idea, and relocating a globe can sometimes be useful. Cast Snow Globe on top of enemies to freeze and launch them out of the area. +2. This is decently useful for getting enemies off of yourself or a defense point, but using it as a way to freeze enemies is yet again not worth it because of Avalanche just doing it better. However, what this tip doesn't mention is that enemies that are frozen and pushed back take a large amount of true damage when colliding with terrain, up to 50% of their maximum health. This is generally too clunky to play around, but with viral or other forms of damage vulnerability, this can start instantly killing enemies. Increase the max health of snow globes with ability strength and armor mods. +3. A really big part of how to build for Snow Globe, and how Frost passive ties into the rest of his kit. The armor scaling really should be added to Snow Globe's description. Frost can cast up to 4 snow globes to cover more ground. +2. This isn't too hard to figure out on your own, but it's still pretty important. The max amount of snow globes could probably be added to the ability stats, to be honest. Snow globes absorb damage and convert it into health within the first few seconds after casting. Cast them while taking heavy damage to convert high levels of damage into its total health. +3. A core part of how Snow Globe works, especially in higher level missions. I feel like this obviously should be in the ability description. Reset the damage absorption period and invulnerability window for an existing Snow Globe by casting a new one inside it. +2. Now, this is more of what an ability tip should be in my opinion. It's a useful mechanic, but not the main way you're supposed to use the ability. It's a slightly more niche, but still really helpful mechanic. It's also worth noting that this does not count toward the max amount of globes, and won't dispel the oldest existing globe. Enemies frozen by Avalanche have reduced armor. +3. The ability stats for Avalanche mention armor removal, but it really should be added to the description too, as removing armor is one of the main reasons to use this ability. Enemies affected by cold status effects also take additional critical damage. Pair Frost with high critical chance weapons to maximize the damage on targets affected by cold. +2. Since Frost is so focused on cold status and freezing enemies, it makes a lot of sense to remind players of this and give an example of how to play around it. Honestly, one of my favorite tips so far. Extra tips. Enemies frozen by Frost abilities are frozen for much longer than the usual 3 seconds, with their freeze effects also scaling with ability duration mods. Corpus nullifiers do not instantly destroy Snow Globe, but instead rapidly drains its health. Enemies affected by Avalanche explode on death, dealing cold damage and applying 1 stack of cold to nearby enemies. Saryn. Saryn can spread spores by killing enemies under the effects of miasma, killing enemies with Molt Explosion, or attacking them while Toxic Lash is active. -2. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff here. Spores is already spread anytime an enemy is killed. They don't have to be affected by miasma or killed by Molt's Explosion. That part is just misleading and confusing. However, spores do spread on every hit while Toxic Lash is active, but that's already mentioned in Toxic Lash's description, so this tip is just not very useful. Combine Toxic Lash with area of effect weapons to spread spores effectively. +1. This is a good tip, even if it feels a little obvious. Cast Molt to give Saryn a brief movement speed boost to escape danger or catch up to enemies. +2. Somehow the ability description for Molt doesn't mention the speed boost at all, although it is listed in the ability stats. It is a pretty major part of why you'd want to use Molt, so it should probably be added to the ability description. Increase Molt's movement speed boost and initial health with ability strength mods. 0. We're back to doing this again. The ability's effects are affected by strength. Is there any reason to call attention to this? It's a pretty standard way for strength mods to affect an ability. Recast Molt to detonate it and deal toxin damage to nearby enemies, and spread spores if the explosion kills them. -1. I don't really get why Molt killing enemies keeps being brought up. It's a 10-meter explosion that does 400 damage with 100% damage fall off. It is not killing anything. While this tip technically does do something, that something is so inconsequential that it's just a waste of time. Cast Molt while under heavy fire to convert incoming damage to health for Saryn's decoy, +3. This explains how Molt can scale into higher level missions, which is a core functionality and should be added to the ability description. Cast Molt to protect Saryn from enemy fire while reviving fallen teammates, +1. It's a fairly obvious use for the ability, but it's still a decent use case. Maximize Spore's corrosive damage by inflicting enemies with multiple casts, +1. I kinda just don't like how this is worded. At first I thought this meant that you should cast Spores multiple times on the same enemy. Maybe something like, Spore's corrosive damage scales faster when multiple enemies are affected, would be a lot clearer. This is also sorta mentioned in the ability description, but it does an even worse job of explaining how it works. It's a core part of how Spores work, so it really sucks that it's explained so badly. Recast Miasma to refresh the viral status effect on previously affected enemies, -1. It doesn't do that. Recasting Miasma just applies another viral status. The old one will still just expire as it isn't refreshed at all. Cast Molt to strip Saryn of all status effects, and any attack that can latch onto her like Latchers from Grineer Seekers or Nox's Toxic Sludge, +3. Molt cleansing status effects is one of the main reasons to use it. It should be in the actual ability description. Extra tips. Spores increased damage gradually decreases if no enemies are infected. Reduce the decay with strength and duration mods, or make sure that at least one enemy is always infected at all times. When spores spread to other enemies, they won't spread it again if they die to spores, so you have to stay active by popping the spore pustules, killing the affected enemies, or hitting them while Toxic Lash is active. Melee attacks, especially slam attacks, are an easy way to burst spores pustules. Spores on an enemy's bodies are destroyed when hit, but instantly regrow somewhere else on the enemy's body. Spores' constant damage prevents enemy shields from recovering. Jump before casting Molt to place the decoy out of range of melee enemies. Banshee. Banshee's passive suppresses all of her and robotic companions' weapons, offering a unique advantage in stealth situations. 0. Banshee's weapons being silenced is mentioned in the passive description, and her companions won't attack if you haven't been spotted yet, so their weapons being silent doesn't really matter. Sonic Boom sends enemies flying, and deals impact damage to those caught in a wave, casted on enemies near cliffs to send them over, +1. Sonic Boom knocking back enemies is already mentioned in the ability description, but using that to yeet enemies off cliffs is a special use case, so this is a useful tip, even if it's pretty obvious. Sonic Fracture is an augment mod for Sonic Boom that temporarily reduces enemy armor, 0. It's just an augment. Enemies stunned by silence are affected by the stealth bonus for the duration of the stun, -1. This is pretty confusing, but it basically means that Banshee is counted as being stealth against enemies stunned by silence. While this lets Banshee get additional affinity from stealth kills, it does not give her the plus 700% stealth melee damage multiplier, which is generally the main thing that matters. Savage Silence is an augment mod for silence that greatly increases finisher damage while the ability is active, 0. It's just an augment again. Highlighted weak spots from recasting Sonar can overlap, increasing the damage multiplier, +3. A really big part of how to get the most out of Sonar. I think this should be mentioned in the ability description, but I can also see how this makes more sense as an ability tip. Resonance is an augment mod for Sonar that creates another Sonar wave when killing an enemy via weak spot, 0. Yet another augment. Combine Sonar with an area of effect weapon to hit multiple enemy weak spots, -2. This is just wrong and misleading. From my testing, explosions don't benefit from Sonar. Enemies closest to Banshee during Soundquake are dealt more damage, -2. No, Soundquake deals the exact same damage regardless of proximity. Resonating Quake is an augment mod for Soundquake that changes the ability into a single powerful sound wave, dealing more damage at the epicenter of the cast, 0. It's, Extra tips. While Soundquake's damage is lacking, it is constant high-ranged area of effect crowd control, which lets Banshee lock down entire maps with ability range mods. Be aware that this is only useful in timer-based missions, as it might slow down progression in kill-based game modes like Defense. Vauban. Vauban's abilities travel in an arc, aim higher to throw farther, +2. While this might seem obvious, it's somewhat difficult to notice in chaotic missions, and it isn't how most other abilities work. It also lets you use your own momentum to throw abilities farther. Deploy multiple Tesla Nervo stones at once by fully charging the ability cast, +2. This is really useful since it lets you get 4 casts for the cost of 1. I think this is another example of a great ability tip. It's useful but not a main part of how Tesla Nervos works. Each Tesla Nervos drone has a limited amount of charges before it must be replaced, +1. This is already mentioned in the ability stats, but I like mentioning it in text as well, to remind players that they have to refresh their drones. Mine layers to the Flechette Orb can be attached to walls and ceilings. Use this to create clever traps for your enemies, +2. This is pretty neat and can lead to some fun setups. Use Vector Overdriver paths to give allies a burst of speed, or to push enemies away from important mission objectives, +1. This is just restating what the Vector Overdriver pad does, though it does also point out the use case of pushing around enemies, so sure it gets a +1. Photon Strike works best when enemies are grouped together, by abilities like Bastile's Vortex or the Tether Flechette Orb, +1. All area of effect attacks are better against grouped enemies since they get to hit more enemies. What this tip should probably mention is that Photon Strike has a guaranteed blast proc, which makes it deal even more damage to grouped enemies as the blast procs overlap. Cast Bastille around defense objectives and down allies who protect them, +1. Crowd controlling enemies makes them pose less of a threat, who would have thought? Though this still gives a clear use case, so sure. Full cast Bastille to deploy a Vortex instead, or to collapse all Bastilles that have already been deployed, +2. This just does a much better job of explaining how the Vortex part of Bastille works, though I'd really prefer if this was just part of the description. Stand inside Bastille to gain armor from trapped enemies. Gain an increased amount when stripping armor from enemies, -1. The fact that Bastille gives armor is already mentioned in the ability description. But the second part is kind of misleading. As armored enemies don't give more armor, it just gives the armor twice as fast. The cap is still the same. Damage from both Mind Layer and Photon Strike scale with enemy level, +3. This is ridiculously impactful. It should absolutely be added to the ability descriptions. Extra tips. The damage buff on Vauban's passive is multiplicative to all other damage buffs. Tesla Nervos can be launched with a Vector Overdriver pad. The Tether Flechette Orb applies guaranteed puncture status. Tesla Nervos, Tether Flechette, Vector Overdriver, Bastille, and Vortex can all have 4 instances active at the same time, allowing Vauban to completely dominate the battlefield by covering it in traps. Crouch or slide to cancel Vector Overdriver's momentum boost. Vortex pulls in Photon Strike to hit the grouped enemies. Nova. Nova's passive applies to all slow effects, not just Molecular Prime. Pair her with weapons that inflict cold status effects, or other Warframes that slow enemies to maximize the benefits, +2. This is another excellent tip. It opens up for cool synergies, even with other Warframes, but it isn't a required part of playing Nova. Nullstar grants a slight damage reduction to Nova for each antimatter particle orbiting her. Increase the number of Nullstars with ability duration for more damage reduction, +2. The ability description already mentions the damage reduction, and the second part is just that it scales with mods. However, the fact that the amount of orbs scale with duration mods isn't super intuitive, so I completely understand having an ability tip for it. Nullstar can be recast while active to refresh the number of antimatter particles, which helps maintain high damage reduction, +2. Not all abilities are recastable, so this is good information to have, especially since Nullstar gets less powerful as the particles fly off. Nullstar's damage reduction can be prolonged with low ability range, maintaining a safe distance from enemies to keep the particles orbiting Nova, +2. Also a really good point that lets you consider how you use and build around Nullstar. Nova and allies can shoot Antimatter Drop's orb to increase its detonation damage. Directing an Antimatter Drop through a wormhole also partially charges the detonation, +2. The first part about shooting to charge is already in the ability description, though this tip also explains that allies can join in, which is pretty cool. The part about wormhole is just really cool and thematically on point. Antimatter Drop will travel quickly to its target once it's fully charged, or if the ability is cast again while in flight, +3. So this is actually only partially correct. The orb will not fly off after being fully charged, but that leaves recasting to redirect as the only real way to use the ability. The ability straight up doesn't work without the recasting part, so it should be part of the ability description. Guide antimatter drop away from objects it can collide with until it has been charged with gunfire, then drop into a crowd for devastating impact, +1. This is explaining how to use the ability, which you could arguably figure out on your own, but it's nice to have it explained here. Wormhole is great for closing both horizontal and vertical distance. Consider casting upwards and jumping to gain elevation quickly, +1. The first part is pretty obvious, the second part is really fun, but also pretty obvious. Consider the combat situation when casting Molecular Prime. Slow enemies when you are overwhelmed, or speed them up when you want to kill more enemies quickly, but be aware that their attacks are sped up as well, +2. This explains why slowing and speeding up enemies might be useful, which might not be obvious at first. It also gives a disclaimer about enemies attacking faster, which is really good to know. Increase the distance that Molecular Prime's wave travels with duration mods, +2. It's pretty unusual that an ability's range scales with duration mods, so it's a decent tip, though it doesn't really explain why it works that way. Arguably, it should mention that range mods still affect the range, so you want a mix of both. Killing enemies primed by Molecular Prime has a 20% chance to inflict blast status effects on nearby foes, +1. Molecular Prime has a base damage of 800, technically 1600 because of the damage vulnerability, and damage falloff, so the damage doesn't seem that exciting, right? However, Molecular Prime's explosion are one of the weirdest effects in the game, being affected by a long list of things. Like, this list is genuinely something else. Kaylee has a lot of content covering these interactions if you're interested. However, this tip doesn't really do anything to hint at how wacky things can get, so it's not that impactful. Extra tips. No Star will target unalerted enemies, making it a bad idea for stealth missions. Antimatter drops absorb damage does not count critical hits or status effects. Focus on dealing more raw damage with mods like Saryn instead. The damage vulnerability from Molecular Prime is not affected by strength and is always 100%. Up to 4 wormhole portals can be active at once. Casting it again will replace the oldest existing portal. Wormhole portals have 4 charges. After using all 4 charges, the portal will disappear. Nova and her allies can fire their weapons through Wormhole. Projectiles consume 1/10 of a portal charge and cause a 0.1 second cooldown before another projectile can pass through. Wormhole can be useful to transport planes of Eidolon drones or defection targets long distances. Molecular Prime starts at 5 meters and expands 5 meters per second up to 30 meters. This results in Molecular Prime's range benefiting more from duration mods than range mods. Nekros. Soul Punch heals existing Shadows of the Dead if the max number of enemies affected are active, +3. Finally, an actual reason to use Soul Punch, so this should definitely be added to the ability description, though this tip doesn't mention that you have to successfully kill an enemy and not just cast the ability. Soul Survivor is an augment for Soul Punch that consumes all of Nekros' energy to revive downed allies instantly, -2. Soul Survivor does not consume all of Nekros' energy, that was changed in patch 32, so this is just discouraging people from using the augment for no reason. Terrify reduces enemy armor and can be stacked multiple times when recast, +1. It's somewhat useful to know that you can cast Terrify twice for a full strip, but Terrify only needs 167% strength to full strip, and even then, full stripping isn't that important anymore. Terrify also costs 75 energy for some reason, so casting it multiple times kinda sucks. Creeping Terrify is an augment mod for Terrify that reduces the movement speed of enemies affected by the ability, 0. This is just an augment. Cast Desecrate in survival and excavation missions to increase the drop chance of life support and power cells, +2. An absolutely incredible tip that points out how Desecrate can be useful outside of just farming loot, making you more excited to play Nekros in those game modes. Combine slash damage weapons with Desecrate to create more enemy parts for loot to drop from, +2. This introduces a really fun mechanic that makes you consider what weapons you equip Nekros with. There is one caveat though. Desecrate can only activate 3 times per second, so in high enemy density missions like Steel Path Survival, you're likely already hitting your cap, so dismembering enemies stops being useful. Despoil is an augment mod for Desecrate that fuels the ability with Nekros' health instead of energy. With it, Nekros can better utilize health orbs created by Desecrate, opening up synergies with powerful mods, 0. This is just an augment. But also, what is synergies with powerful mods supposed to mean? The only thing that comes to mind is Arcane Avenger, but that's not a mod, and Despoil can't even activate it. If it's referring to the health orb generation, that's not part of the augment, that's part of the base ability, so it just doesn't make any sense. Enemies that spawn additional units continue to do so even after they're summoned as Shadows of the Dead, +2. a super cool mechanic that lets Nekros do some fun stuff with the summons. Interestingly, the secondary summons aren't affected by the constant health drain. Recast Shadows of the Dead to fully heal them, for less time than a regular cast, +3. This really should be in the ability description, as it ends up being how you use the ability most of the time. Decrease the rate at which shadows lose health over time with duration mods, +1. This is sorta mentioned in the ability stats, but it might not be super intuitive, so it's nice to have it explained here. Enemies that are below 25% health are instantly killed by Soul Punch and turn into a Shadow of the Dead, up until the max amount of enemies affected, +3. This is the main reason to ever use Soul Punch. Why the hell is this not mentioned in the ability description instead of the deadly projectile that does 50 damage and doesn't scale with strength? This actually kind of pisses me off. Extra tips. Scan enemies raised as shadows for more codex research progress. Enemies hit by Soul Punch are marked for 3 seconds. Marked enemies become shadows on death. If an enemy is marked multiple times, multiple shadows are created. Terrifier's armor reduction wears off after the effect ends. Hunt down the fleeing enemies while they are weakened. Desecrate gives an extra 60% chance for health orbs to drop, and if that happens, there's a 90% chance for extra loot. This results in a 54% chance for extra loot to drop. Valkyr. Valkyr is immune to heavy landings, meaning there's no delay when landing on the ground from great heights, +1. I didn't realize that this was removed from her passive description. It should be mentioned somewhere, so I think this works fine as an ability tip. But heavy landings are also pretty easy to avoid, so this isn't that big of a deal. Perform frequent melee attacks to keep Valkyr's rage meter from decreasing, 0. Melee attacks charge the rage meter, which is what the passive description already says. Finisher kills grants a greater increase to the rage meter, +1. This is pretty cool and something you probably wouldn't figure out on your own. But the rage meter is so easy to fill that there isn't much incentive to go for finishers to charge it. Cast Ripline in quick succession to increase its damage, and greatly reduce its energy cost after each successful cast, +1. The damage increase is pretty unimpactful, but the decreased energy cost is quite nice. This is pretty tileset dependent, but especially newer tiles like Halvania and the Peruta Rebellion are excellent for Ripline. Use Ripline strategically by using melee attacks to cancel the pull, while maintaining momentum or jump for a speed boost, +2. This is movement tech, hell yeah. I just genuinely really like this tip, there's not much else to say. Warcry affects all allies that are within the shared affinity radius. Use the player list to see who is within range, +1. The ability description already says that it affects allies in affinity range, but the explanation of how to check who is within affinity range is still kinda helpful. Warcry also applies to friendly NPCs, such as rescue targets and specters, +1. I mean, sure, but you're usually just giving them some armor. I'm not super well versed in specters, but from what I know, this generally shouldn't be that impactful. Warcry grants significantly more armor while Hysteria is active, 0. Hysteria's ability description already mentions this. I also think that this tip should probably specify that only Valkyr gets the extra armor. The stagger from paralysis briefly opens enemies to finishers, allowing faster increase of Valkyr's rage meter, +1. This is cool, but the stagger is so short that you'll only ever get like 1 to 2 finishers, and as I mentioned earlier, the rage meter is just really easy to fill anyway. Valkyr's Hysteria talons can be separately modded in the arsenal, +3. Again, why can't this just be in the ability description? Temporarily deactivate Hysteria by switching to Valkyr's primary or secondary weapon. Reactivate it by attacking with Valkyr's talons, +1. This tip is pretty confusing, as swapping to a primary or secondary doesn't deactivate Hysteria, it just turns off its effects. The energy drain still continues in the background. I also don't like how this is worded, as it seems to imply that you would want to deactivate Hysteria on purpose. I think it should say, swapping to a primary or secondary weapon disables the status effect immunity and increased armor from Warcry. Overall, just a really weird tip that just explains something in a really awkward way. Extra tips. The rage meter's damage buff is additive to mods like Pressure Point, letting Valkyr skip these in favor of other mods. Ripline moves more than 4 times faster when pulling Valkyr to an enemy. Enemies grouped by Ripline are open to ground finishers. Oberon. Oberon's Righteous Negation passive can be activated using health orbs from Reckoning, or any other source. This also includes Universal Orbs, +2. The first part is just pointing out a fairly obvious synergy, but clarifying that Universal Orbs also work is really good, especially since Oberon is quite likely to run Arcane Fallout. Smite removes overguard and armor from the initial target, and also scales based on the target's max health and shield values. Eximus units are prioritized when casting into larger groups of enemies, since they're the ideal target. +3. Smite's description never actually mentions that it does max health damage. It just says additional damage 35%, which is a little confusing. Maybe it could say like 35% health damage or something. The part about prioritizing targeting Eximus units is a great tip though, a good piece of quality of life that most players likely wouldn't figure out on their own. Enemies targeted by Smite are vulnerable to melee finishers for a short time. +2. Enemies are actually open to finishers for an entire 5 seconds, and with the defense strip and % health damage, it's a great way to set enemies up for finishers. This is ultimately more about setting up for finishers and parasol finishers and their synergies, than finishers being a good way to kill enemies after using Smite. Anything is easy to kill after stripping its overguard, shields, armor, and up to 75% of its health. Up to 3 hallowed ground fields can be active at once. Spread them across the battlefield to boost renewal healing for allies and to sow chaos with radiation status effects. +3. Being able to have multiple hallowed grounds active at the same time is not mentioned in the ability description, which I think it should be. The other information is pretty basic, but does give a concrete use case. Enter Oberon's affinity range while Renewal is active to gain the buff. The effects of Renewal continue to benefit allies for as long as the ability is active, even if they move out of the initial range. +3. Renewal actually doesn't have a listed range at all, which is incredibly confusing. While that part should obviously be added to the ability description, the second part about allies keeping the buff works great as a tip. Summoned allies such as Spectres and Nekros' Shadows also benefit from Renewal's various positive effects. +2. Pretty cool, especially for Nekros' Shadows as it helps with the damage over time, and the armor also helps them stay alive. However, like enemies, the Shadows can only have up to 2700 armor, 90% damage reduction, and beyond that, Renewal's armor buff won't affect them. Nekros and Oberon Yaoi is real and canon. Renewal will negate status effects when the target is at maximum health. +3. First of all, Renewal's description just fails to mention the status immunity, and that should probably be added. But also, I just think that this is such a weird way for this to work. You lose the status immunity if you rely on the healing to stay alive. Renewal grants additional armor for allies with each target hit by Reckoning. This armor increase will remain as long as Renewal remains active. +1. This tip is useful, but is not explained very well. Basically, Reckoning grants Oberon up to 1000 extra armor, and Renewal's armor buff is based on Oberon's armor, so that means Reckoning indirectly gives allies more armor. I don't really like the second part though. The bonus armor from Reckoning only lasts for 30 seconds, after which both Oberon and allies lose it. Personally, I changed it to something like, the armor Oberon gains from Reckoning is added to Renewal's armor buff, making it more potent for allies. Cast Renewal to increase the bleed out time for downed allies. -2. I might be doing something wrong, but I just can't see it working in practice. Reckoning deals significantly more damage to enemies already affected by radiation status effects. Weaken enemies with hallowed ground, then strike them down. +2. The ability stats do mention bonus radiation damage 750, but it's not quite clear what this means. I think this tip should say, Reckoning deals 10% more damage per radiation status effects, up to 100% more damage. The mention of using hallowed ground to apply radiation first is a good tip though. I like that. Extra tips. Smite's damage can only go up to 75% maximum health damage with strength, but with viral or other forms of damage vulnerability, it can potentially instantly kill enemies. The armor Oberon gets from Renewal is multiplicative to mods like Steel Fiber, and the armor from Reckoning. Zephyr. While using Tailwind Flight mode, you can stay airborne as long as you have energy. 0. The toggled ability that drains energy stops being active when there's no more energy. Yeah, that's how energy works. Cast Tailwind in short bursts to quickly travel across the plane of Eidolon or the Orb Valis. +1. This is a pretty niche and obvious use case, but it's a half-decent use case nonetheless. Cast Tailwind's Dive Bomb at greater heights to increase the damage dealt on impact. +2. The damage is multiplied by 20% for every meter after 4 meters. So for example, 320% damage after 20 meters. This is cool, but often still not enough damage to really be worth keeping in mind, unless you're using the augment mod target fixation, in which case this becomes crucial information. Cast Tailwind and Air Burst while Zephyr is airborne to decrease the energy cost. +3. It's half energy by the way, it should save half their energy cost. Fun fact, since Hover can only be cast in the air, it will always only cost half its listed cost. Either way, this is really impactful and lets Zephyr spam these abilities, so I really think it should be added to their descriptions. Tornadoes transfer allied weapon damage to each enemy held in Zephyr's tornadoes. Fire powerful weapons into them to deal massive damage to the group of captured enemies. +2. This tip feels like it's mostly here just to point out that allies can also shoot into Tornado to increase its damage, which is a pretty decent tip. Cast Turbulence while hovering above enemies to attack them with the added protection from their projectiles. +2. I think what this tip is maybe trying to explain is that using Turbulence and staying above enemies lets you avoid both melee and ranged attacks. But if that's the case, it could have been explained way better. It's still good advice that people should follow, even if it doesn't do a great job explaining why they should do it. Hold to cast a Wandering Tornado, and command the direction it travels by aiming down sights at it, and then moving the reticle to a desired location, -1. Okay, this one is wrong. Hold casting creates stationary tornadoes, while tap casting creates wandering tornadoes. Also, Tornado always creates 3 tornadoes, and this tip specifically says a singular tornado. This tip is arguably useful for pointing out that you can guide the tornado by aiming down sights, but trying to do that is clunky and awkward as hell. Separate tornadoes inflict the elemental damage type based on which type is the majority of the damage absorbed, 0. The base description already says this, almost word for word. Each of Zephyr's tornadoes can have different elemental damage types, +2. This is good, solid information that is worth playing around, and it does make sense as an ability tip as it is a slightly more niche thing to do. Extra tips. Zephyr maintains all the momentum from Tailwind if she is still in the air when it ends. Airburst projectiles only activate when hitting terrain, not when hitting enemies. Stand next to defense objectives with Turbulence active to deflect enemy attacks away from it. Hydroid. Once Hydroid damages an enemy, his passive applies to corrosive status effects from any source, even those applied by allies, +1. I feel like this is fairly obvious, but it's good to have it confirmed in an ability tip. Cast Tempest Barrage on Corpus Nullifiers to shrink and burst their bubbles, +2. A pretty unique use case, as Nullifiers are usually the counter to Warframe abilities, so this is a pretty solid tip. Tempest Barrage can be recast to create multiple barrage areas, +2. While Tempest Barage's damage isn't that impressive, the fact that you can have an infinite amount of barrages active at the same time is kinda crazy. Cast Tidal Surge to get out of tough situations quickly, with brief invulnerability while cleansing negative status effects, +3. This is one of the main reasons to use Tidal Surge. The status cleanse should absolutely be part of the ability description. Honestly, the description for Tidal Surge just doesn't explain anything at all. Casting Plunder removes any corrosive status effects currently affecting enemies, permanently reducing their maximum armor based on the corrosive status removed, +2. I had no idea this was how the ability worked. Turning corrosive into a permanent armor strip is really cool, though most of the time you should be killing enemies before corrosive status wears off, so it's not anything that crazy. Stack up corrosive status with Hydroid's abilities before casting Plunder to maximize its effects. Reach 100% armor reduction with Hydroid's passive to permanently remove all of their armor, +2. The second part is pretty stupid. 100% armor strip removes all armor, that's what 100% means. Still, this is advice you should absolutely follow, as applying corrosive before casting Plunder makes an absolutely massive difference. Bring weapons with corrosive status to bolster Hydroid's abilities, or bring weapons with viral damage to take advantage of their lack of armor, -2. I don't really see how corrosive weapons would bolster Hydroid's abilities. They're already really good at applying corrosive, so bringing a weapon that also applies corrosive seems pretty pointless. Also, I've seen some people think that Viral's damage vulnerability does not apply to armored targets, since they have armor protecting their health bar, and this tip feels like it's reinforcing that misconception, which I don't really like. Also, sure, Viral offers more damage when enemies are armor stripped, but that's because anything does more damage when enemies are armor stripped. There's no real specific synergy at play. Tidal Surge can drag enemies into an area locked down by Tempest Barrage and Tentacle Swarm, +3. Wow, it would be so cool if Tidal Surge's ability description said literally anything at all. The fact that Tidal Surge groups enemies and drags them along should pretty obviously be part of the ability description, though the part of using it to move enemies into the zones of Tempest Barrage and Tentacle Swarm works pretty well as an ability tip. Tentacle Swarm's tentacles will automatically find a new target if their current target dies, no need to recast, +1. I feel like this is pretty intuitive, and it would be really weird if it didn't work this way, but I guess it's good to have it confirmed here. Use the Pilfering Swarm augment to gain extra loot from enemies that die while held by Tentacle Swarm, 0. It's just another augment. Extra tips. Corrosive status removes up to 80% of an enemy's armor at 10 stacks. With Hydroid's passive, it instead removes 100% armor at 10 stacks. Tempest Mirage can target any area within 100 meters. Use this to lock down parts of the map you can't reach in time. Range mods don't affect the area that is bombarded by Tempest Mirage, but instead affects the size of each explosion within the area. When Tidal Surge ends, enemies dragged along are briefly open to ground finishers. Jump to cancel Tidal Surge early and preserve the momentum. Thunder hits in a cone in front of Hydroid. Be sure to position yourself accordingly before casting, though honestly, this should probably be mentioned in the ability description instead, as trying to cast it thinking it's an area of effect around Hydroid will lead to problems. I definitely thought that's how it worked before testing it myself. Mirage. Only a couple of the mirror clones fire with Mirage, but all of them perform melee attacks, +3. To clarify real quick, there are 4 clones and only 2 of them fire guns, but all 4 perform melee attacks, which is really confusing. But it's about to get even weirder. The clones do 30% damage with primary and secondary, and 15% with melees. So yeah, the listed 20% damage from the ability stats is wrong. Fun. Additionally, the 15 or 30% also dictates the critical and status chance for the clones. They only get that percent of the weapon's modded critical and status chance. Critical damage is unaffected though. While Mirage needs 667% strength for the clones to match her melee attacks, with 334% they match her primary and secondary weapons, and any strength above that is not just more damage, but a multiplicative buff to modded critical and status chance, which can do some pretty silly stuff. In the end, I think the ability description should be updated to— wait, hold on. What do you mean the Hall of Mirrors description doesn't mention the clones attacking? Alright, that should be added too, I guess. What the hell? Anyways, it should mention only 2 clones shooting weapons, and the 15% 30% thing should be added to the ability stats. Alternatively, maybe you could just have all 4 clones fire primary and secondaries, but nerf their multiplier to 15%. Hall of Mirrors clones mimic different weapon attacks, including alt fires and melee heavy attacks, +2. This feels fairly obvious and intuitive, but this tip does inspire players to try out some fun new interactions. Somewhat related, the clones will always perform the second attack and heavy attack combos with some melee weapons like the chlorophyll or gunblades. Cast Hall of Mirrors to draw enemy fire to Mirage's clone instead of her, +1. The ability description already kinda mentions this, but I think this tip explains it slightly better. Honestly, I'd probably change it to enemies are more likely to target Hall of Mirrors clones instead of Mirage herself, to make it even clearer. Equip Mirage with area of effect weapons to quickly clear rooms of enemies with the help of Hall of Mirrors clones, +1. Also pretty obvious. AoE weapons are great at dealing with crowds, so shooting the AoE weapon 3 times at once deals with crowds even better. Still, it gives a specific use case by pointing out the synergy with specific weapons. Sleight of Hand turns security cameras into allies, keeping them from activating laser barriers when detected, +2. Honestly, a decent use case for Sleight of Hand, which might not always be super practical, but it's very fun. Cast Sleight of Hand when there is a large amount of ammo pickups on the ground for a chance that they'll randomly explode and deal cold damage to nearby enemies, +3. Sleight of Hand turning pickups into explosives is often the main reason to use it, so it really should be part of the ability description. Also, to be clear, it's not actually a random chance, it's just guaranteed whenever the enemy is close enough to the pickup. Also, while ammo pickups deal cold damage, health orbs deal heat damage, energy orbs deal electric, and affinity orbs deal toxin. Total Eclipse is an augment mod for Eclipse that grants allies in its range its benefits, 0. This tip could have actually been really useful if it mentioned that Total Eclipse also applies to Hall of Mirrors clones, which is a powerful and cool interaction. And yes, without Total Eclipse, the clones do not benefit from Eclipse. While this tip says allies, I don't think that really explains that this also applies to the clones, and I don't really expect anyone to figure that out just from this tip, so it's still a 0. Sleight of Hand is especially useful in Spy and Rescue mission, casted when enemies are rushed into consoles to cause an explosion, +1. This is again just explaining what Sleight of Hand does because the actual description is so damn vague. This is ultimately a minor effect compared to the pickup explosives, but it's still somewhat useful, most of the time. Technically, if an enemy is crowd control immune, because of Overguard for example, this can make them run to a console to start an alarm, not get knocked back by the explosive, and activate a lockdown that they otherwise wouldn't have. To be clear, this is pretty uncommon, but it can happen and it does kinda suck. Prism bounces off of surfaces and can be especially useful in narrow pathways, +2. Good to know and can lead to some funky plays, it's nice to have it explained here. With the Solar Eclipse buff active, Prism deals double damage. With the Lunar Eclipse buff active, Prism's casting cost is halved, +3. A really cool synergy that is a big part of using Prism. This would be really nice to have in the Prism description. This tip could at least be updated to say that Lunar Eclipse doesn't just have the casting cost, but its entire cost, including the drain. Shout out to this tip for actually saying doubled instead of increased though. Extra tips. This isn't really a tip, but I just think it's really stupid that Eclipse and Vex Armor's description use the exact same wording, despite Eclipse being multiplicative and Vex Armor being additive. This really should be changed in some way. Blinding enemies with Prism grants Mirage the 700% melee damage stealth bonus against them. Every time Prism hits an enemy, its damage is increased by 25%. The more enemy it hits, the faster its damage scales. Though this is definitely a +3 kind of tip, and most likely should just be part of the actual ability description. And that's the first 20 frames. The current plan is to just focus on making the other parts of the series, with the next video covering the frames between Limbo and Grendel, the list of which is on screen right now. If you have any greater experience or opinions on any of these frames, I'll probably be posting a community post in the coming days, looking for anyone who's willing to help with the next video. Once I've covered all frames, I'll plan on making one big combined video, which also lets me tweak and update things. So if you have anything to add or correct about the frames in this video, please let me know in the comments, as I'll be able to add that in the final video. Lastly, this video just took a really long time because I ended up doing some other stuff, so hopefully the next video shouldn't be too far away. Hopefully that statement won't age terribly. Lastly, I want to take some time to just give a massive shout out to the people who helped make this video. Thanks to Rowan is a Mac main, Julio, Emmelistic, Professor Dystopia, Ketchup, Zari, Deathcrown, Kaylee, Sandra, Locket, James Spangler, Ace, and Ruby Blossom.